I forgot to put the outline on this set of slides. So we are at confession. Remember, they were all alliterated with C. We are skipping a few things. We skipped, companionship, David's friendship with Jonathan. We didn't camp on that at all. We went to compassion with Mephibosheth in we went to covenant, actually, in chapter 7, compassion in chapter 9 with Mephibosheth, collapse in chapter 11, David's sin with Bathsheba. So here we are at confession. Both the first part of this evening, before the break, and the second part of this evening, after the break, are both going to be about confession. This was not my original plan, but looking at this material, I thought it might be good just to cover 2 Samuel 12, 1 through 15 in the first half, and then take a look at Psalm 51. Take a look at David's confession that we have recorded there, and see what we can learn about what biblical confession ought to sound like. And so that's what we're going to try to do in the second half. But I got a ton of slides. I'll probably do most of the talking tonight, but maybe have some time at the end of both the first half and second half to see if anybody has questions, comments, or feedback. And then next week, the plan is to either finish with the census that David takes at the end of his life. It's kind of a head scratcher. It's like, what exactly is going on there? Remember, David starts taking a census. It angers the Lord. The Lord gives David some options about how he's going to be punished, and he selects a particular option. But there's a lot of significance moving forward in the progress of redemption as to what happens on that occasion. If I can put the material together, instead of doing that next week, I might push that off to the 11th, and then we would consider consequences next week. Part of the challenge of consequences is it takes a huge chunk of narrative when it gets to the consequences of David's sin and as it affects his family. Particularly, I would probably emphasize what's going on with Absalom. But yeah, some of you are already nodding your head. It's like, yeah, that's a heavy section there, and so it kind of depends on how much I can navigate through that much material and pare it down for an hour and a half. But anyway, that's the plan. So either we'll go consequences next week and census the week after, or census next week, and then just to carry out the alliteration, that would be the conclusion. All right. So David has committed adultery, and he has arranged for Uriah's murder. That's what's happened. That's what we read about in 2 Samuel chapter 11. We went from this ethical high point, we went from the theological high point in 2 Samuel 7 with God making this covenant with David about someone from his lineage being on an everlasting throne, theological high point, to the ethical high point of Mephibosheth, to just 2 chapters later from Mephibosheth, this David's committing adultery with Bathsheba and arranging for Uriah's murder. Uriah was Bathsheba's husband. So, what happens now? Well, it would seem like, the Lord is aware of this. Chapter 11 ends with, do you remember? It's kind of significant because there's this language earlier in the chapter about don't let this thing be evil in your eyes, that Uriah might happen to die in warfare. But then the end of the chapter, remember what the line is? Todd's looking right at us. You might as well just read it.
No, I don't. You talking about 26?
27.
27. And when the morning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
Yeah, so there you go. So there's this ominous ending of chapter 11. But of course you know that there's no actual chapter divisions in the inspired text. And so you're thinking, okay, God knows what David has done. It seems like David has done everything he's had to do to cover this whole thing up, right? Bathsheba's pregnant. Her husband's dead. He takes Bathsheba as his own wife, and it's like, nobody's going to take the time to do the math. Maybe JJ and Roger would sit down and try to do the math. But no one else is thinking, it's okay. She's pregnant with David's child. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. And so what's going to happen? Well, the seeking God sends grace to reclaim his straying sheep. There's all kinds of ways God could react, but the whole first part of the chapter is this pursuit of David by God in his grace. So it's just 15 verses. So, if somebody has their Bible open, I can read from my phone. But if someone would like to read for us tonight, I'll take a volunteer. Todd, you go ahead and get that. Just go ahead and read the whole thing. First 15 verses.
And the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, There were 2 men in a certain city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had very many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. He brought it up, and it grew up with him and with his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink from his cup and lie in his arms, and it was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. Nathan said to David, You are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. And I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and of Judah. And this, if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, The Lord has put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. And then Nathan went to his house.
All right. Thank you, Todd. Okay, so there you have it. Those are the verses that immediately follow the events of chapter 11. So, if this is the thematic statement, the seeking God sends grace to reclaim his straying sheep, then one of the things that we want to emphasize is this grace, the sending of grace. Although, again, I don't want to get into too much of the thematic statement, but, I crafted this intentionally, using this language of, shepherding, how a shepherd is seeking someone who has strayed. This seeking God is something that we see consistently in Scripture. And it's not just kind of an isolated occasion where this is how God responds to someone who is acting in disobedience or who is straying. Can you think of, does anybody immediately come to mind scripturally where you kind of see this seeking God? Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. Jonah, Jonah's given a command by the Lord to go to Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria, enemy of Israel at the time, very much a threat. And Jonah tries to go to Tarshish. If you maybe studied geography or somebody's maybe pointed this out before, Tarshish is like way over towards Spain. It was like the end of the known world in that direction. So it's like Jonah's trying to get as far away as he possibly can in the opposite direction. And God pursues him. He doesn't strike him down. He pursues him and makes sure he goes on the mission he's supposed to, which he does. But yeah, God is pursuing Jonah. But you can actually go all the way back to the garden, and this is when this starts. But it's a little bit more subtle. The first question in the Bible is posed by the serpent. Did God really say that? Second question of the Bible is posed by God. Anybody know what it is?
Where are you?
Where are you? Hey, God's walking in the garden. Adam and Eve are hiding now because they've sinned. They're naked. They're trying to cover their shame, trying to cover their guilt. And God comes seeking them and says, "Where are you?" And you can tell by the events that follow. It's not this tyrant who's out to kill Adam and Eve. It's a shepherd who's seeking them to expose their sin, to confront them with the reality of what they've done. And then by the end of the chapter, he's covered their shame and their guilt. And so this idea of a seeking shepherd is something we consistently see through the Bible. And of course, when we think about how that anticipates David's greater son, then you get to John 11, and here's Jesus. I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for my sheep. And of course, he tells parables about seeking after lost sheep. So, yeah, I don't know that would have jumped out necessarily just reading the language here, but the seeking God was intentional in my mind, just to kind of capture this kind of shepherding idea that we have here, even in chapter 12. So, 3 things: pursuing grace, humbling grace, and atoning grace is, I think, what we see in the chapter. So, first thing to notice is that Yahweh, or the Lord, takes action. And this is significant because you can read all of chapter 11. And the Lord's, now he's not mentioned until verse 27. All the action is taken by other people. And one of the most significant things that we see in chapter 11 with the action is the sending. In fact, I hate to do this on my phone. I've got to have a book, but listen to this. Same Hebrew word, something Dale Ralph Davis captures well in his commentary. That's how chapter 11 begins. This is verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab. It's the occurrence of that word, sent. David's doing the sending. Verse 3. And David sent and inquired about the woman. Second occasion of that word. Verse 4. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Verse 5. And the woman conceived, and she sent and told David, I'm pregnant. So there's just all this sending going on. I think we get to a point where Joab is doing some sending. David sent word to Joab in verse 6. Joab sent Uriah to David. Then we skip down to verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. Verse 18. It's interesting how the English translation is actually capturing the Hebrew word behind all this. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And finally, verse 22. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent to tell him. And then finally, David sent and brought Bathsheba into this. So there's clearly in the entire chapter, there's this strong movement forward that's captured by the sending going on. And so, Todd, go ahead and read again the very first verse of chapter 12.
And the Lord sent to David.
There you go. That's good. All right, so there's all this sending going on all the way through chapter 11. The Lord's barely mentioned until the end. And now, verse 1 is, and the Lord sent to David. So now the Lord is the one doing the acting. And what does he do? Well, you think, oh, well, he's going to let David have it. But he doesn't. Doesn't send him wrath, doesn't send him destruction, doesn't send him death. He sends him a prophetic gift. Now, I have that in quotes because some of you know why that would be in quotes. Why could we say that God sends David a prophetic gift?
Mercy. No.
I know. As soon as I say it, you'll know it.
Strike him down and kill him right off the bat, which in some circumstances he might have done.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's what David deserves according to the law, right? I mean, he's committed adultery, and he basically murdered a man.
Well,
Yeah. What's that?
2 of the big ones.
Yeah, right. Those pretty big ones.
Well, he's not being direct saying you did this. The gift is to make him, I think, think it through. Like,
Let's
think through this. What's going on here?
Right. Yeah. Nathan is masterful as a prophet. Now, whether the Lord inspired that story, gave him that story, I mean, we're not told, but the way Nathan confronts David with his sin is, it's pretty remarkable. Now, I figured, how many of you know what the name Nathaniel means?
Gift of gift.
There you go.
Okay.
That's why I just have this in quotes here. Nathan, the Hebrew word Nathan is a verb. It means to give. And so, Nathanael means L, when you get that
Gift of
language in there,
God.
gift of God. There you go. That's right. So that's why I have that in there. So he sends him this prophetic gift in the prophet Nathan. But notice, God is the one doing the pursuing here. That's why we're talking about pursuing grace. David's not going to God. God is going to David. And this is out of grace. This is out of love for David. He loves David too much to just allow him to persist and to sit in his sin. And so he goes after David. David is not the one pursuing God. Of course, maybe one lesson here to note briefly. God's grace is an initiating grace to rescue the lost and the erring, or you could say erring. And so for those that are lost and don't know him, he pursues lost sinners. But also those who are his own, who are straying, he pursues them as well by his own initiative, out of grace and out of love. He will not allow you to be lost. He will not allow you to stray outside of the scope of his care. Even if you don't want him to, he will pursue you. And there are occasions where it's just like, just leave me alone, God. I don't want my sanctification. I don't want my holiness as much as you do. And it's like, that's true. I don't, and you don't either. God is persistent. And he will continue that work in you until he's finished with it. Even when you don't want him to. Because he loves you more than you do. And he cares about your holiness more than you do. And so, I think there's some encouragement there for us. But yeah, so going to this humbling grace. The grace that God sends is not soft. It's not indulgent. It doesn't tell David not to worry about it. It's no big deal. Nothing like that. I mean, it's a strong kind of grace that confronts David. It penetrates, it exposes, and is painfully convicting. But all those things are done out of grace. If you just stay unaware of true guilt, well, I'm going to get into some of these things, I guess. So, yeah, just to go into Nathan's story, we won't spend a ton of time in it, other than just to say that confronting people is hard, and it's good to think and pray about how we can best approach people when they need to be corrected, when certain things need to be exposed. Now, can we always be as creative as Nathan is here? Probably not. I mean, I can't be. But to be thoughtful, purposeful about how might this person respond? And how can I do this in such a way that might be most effective for the reclaiming or the correcting of the person I'm talking to? So this is not about me. This is about the person I'm communicating with. So how might we do that well? Because it's hard to confront and correct. So we need to be prayerful and thoughtful about it. I mean, Nathan's just great here. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is these allusions to drinking, eating, and lying in verse 3 in chapter 12. Okay, these are words that Nathan is using to David as part of the story. And of course, you get the story, right? I mean, David is the rich man. The other's poor. David has all these wives. Uriah has one wife. The one little ewe lamb which he had bought, and he bought it with, and he brought it up, grew it up with him and with his children. So it's very near and dear to him. It used to eat of his morsel, and drink of his cup, and lie in his arms. There's those three words, right? It used to eat of his morsel, drink of his cup, and lie in his arms. And it was like a daughter to him. This traveler comes in. The rich man doesn't want to use one of the animals from his own flock, even though he's got a bunch, right? So this is David's position. You've got a lot of women, David, as a king, and you choose to steal another man's wife, take another man's wife, and then when scandal develops, you take the man's life from him. But what I wanted to show you is that if you go back to chapter 11, verse 11, listen to the words that Uriah says to David when David's trying plan A, right, to get Uriah to sleep with his wife and pass the pregnancy off as Uriah. Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go down to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife?" It's the exact same words used there. And perhaps Nathan is hoping that will, trigger something for David. But it doesn't. He remains fairly dull and unaware of that. But it's very creative. There's interesting things said about this. I think in Davis's commentary, he quotes Alexander White, where he says, Nathan had a sword an inch from David's, did I say that right? Nathan has a sword an inch from David's conscience before David even knows that Nathan has a sword. And then there's a good quote here by Augustine. To cut away diseased tissue in David's heart and heal the wound there, Nathan used David's tongue as a knife. And of course, that gets to David's own, condemnation of the person, and then that great, the great statement by Nathan: "You are the man. You the man." That's right.
Was that Dale Ralph Davis? Is that the first quote you gave?
It's Dale Ralph Davis quoting a guy named Alexander White.
Okay.
About the sword.
Sword, yeah.
Conscience, yeah.
Really...
So I just put this in here because I didn't want to forget the illustration. I've read that there are carpet cleaners that can go into people's homes and shine special kinds of lights in the home that will show like pet stains from urination. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. And what's interesting is you can't see that stuff unless the right kind of light is on it. And then when the light is shined on it, you're just like, oh my gosh, this is filthy. Please clean this stuff up. And it was a pretty good sales technique, right? It's like, listen, you've got filth in here that you don't see. And it takes the right light to shine on it to see it. Well, welcome to 2 Samuel 12, where it's like David's got sin in his heart, filth in his heart that's sitting there, that's decaying, that's corrupting. David's not doing anything about it. God sends Nathan and shines a light on that. And through this very creative story in which he draws condemnation out of David's own mouth. It's quite a brilliant scene. And so David's guilt and shame are exposed here. So we're still talking about humbling grace, right? God will pursue, but it's not this indulgent kind of pursuit. He's confronting David with the reality of guilt and shame. They're exposed, but it's great. It's grace that has exposed it, because it's here that healing can begin. Now, this is just my language here. Ask any recovering alcoholic or an addict. Humbly admitting you have a problem is the first step to recovery. If you're unaware of it or denying it, you're not going to get anywhere. And so David's not really, he's suppressing it here, but he needs to acknowledge what he's done. He needs to acknowledge that there's guilt and shame that needs to be dealt with. The pain of conviction and the sting of actual guilt and real shame are works of grace. There's a reason I put actual guilt and real guilt here. The pain of conviction and the sting of these things are works of grace. But that's when guilt is actual and shame is real. Because, I've taught on this in different contexts before, but I'm sensitive to this because there are a lot of people who struggle with guilt. That's not real guilt. Like, guilt, you should feel guilty when you've done something wrong. There are people who are burdened with guilt that there's not a wrong that's been done. They've taken upon themselves some kind of responsibility that is not really theirs to own. I mean, just think about, so some of you might know a little bit of what I'm talking about here because the family is connected to New Life, but, I probably shouldn't use that story now because some of you might not have known the circumstances of the person's death, but as an 18-year-old, when I graduated high school, I worked in a factory for a little while. And I wasn't going to go to college when I graduated high school because I didn't like high school. And I worked in this factory for a summer. That's the only reason I went to college. Because it was a difficult experience. But there was a guy maybe 10 years older than me. So he'd been about 28, worked right next to me. And about 2 years earlier than that, his child, infant child, maybe he was a toddler, fell out of his car while he was driving it, and the child died. And I could tell, this guy struggled with the guilt of that happening. And, I'm 18 years old. I'm not a Christian when I'm 18, so I don't know what to say to the guy. What I would say to him now is, that's not your fault. Like, there's things that you can't control. I don't know if the kid was strapped in or whatever it would happen to be. Like, accidents happen. Like, you can't conduct your life perfectly to prevent all possibilities of tragedies happening. And I've talked to lots and lots of people that bear that kind of guilt. I should have done something. What did you think you were going to do? People make choices. Those who have children who have died by suicide, often accompanied by deep guilt over, I should have done something. What did we do wrong? Why do you think you did something wrong? So our guilt sensors are not accurate. And this can happen in either direction, right? Some people can feel guilt when they're not actually guilty of doing something wrong. Other people have done something wrong and they don't feel any guilt. So obviously our guilt sensors are not entirely reliable. But there is such a thing as real guilt. And David is really guilty here. And that needs to be exposed. There's also false shame. People often feel a sense of shame, not because of things that they've done, but because of things that have been done to them. And they take a lot of blame of that. They sense a lot of shame for that. But that's not real shame. It's not what they did. It's not who they are. It's what's been done to them in ways that they've been treated. But there's, at the same time, just as our guilt sensors are not accurate, our shame sensors aren't accurate either. And some people should be ashamed of things that they've done, things that they are doing, and they don't feel that way. But there is real shame. So David, in this particular instance, he has real guilt, he has real shame, and the Lord pursues him in that, and he exposes him in that. Because David needs to own that. We're going to see how he owns that in Psalm 51. But that's important to own guilt and to own real shame. It's also important to let go of false guilt and let go of false shame. It's really hard for people to do, though. Sometimes it's harder to convince people that they're not guilty when they feel guilty than it is to try to convince people that they are guilty when they don't feel guilty. But David shows he's a man after God's own heart, not by being sinless, but by how he responds to God's humbling grace in humble confession. And so when we get to, I think it's after verse 9, yeah, it's toward verse 13, where he just says, I've sinned against the Lord. Like he doesn't hide that. Acknowledges the reality of his sin. But he does more than that. We know that from Psalm 51. We'll look at that in a little bit. But the last thing here, let's talk about atoning grace to wrap this up, verses 10 through 15. Atoning grace doesn't mean that all temporal consequences of sin are removed. This is very clear with Nathan's words to David about the violence in his household will not depart. Well, what does he say? Exact language. It will not depart from your household. I don't think violence is the word there. Todd, what is it?
Evil.
Okay, evil will not depart from your household. And of course, when we get into 2 Samuel 13, 14, 15, 16, we see this playing out. But I've said before, if you read all the way through 2 Samuel, it's as evident as anything as you're reading through it that a dramatic change happens in the narrative of David's life at 2 Samuel 11. It is never the same after that. Through the entire rest of his life. Like chapter 11 just it changes everything. And there are consequences within the house of David where things are not good. So consequences, remember, is what is the title of the lessons if we're going to talk about Absalom. And it's just something for us to reckon with. Drug abuse has consequences. Deception, lying, betraying someone's trust has consequences. And it's beyond just saying, oh, I'm sorry I lied to you. No, trust is broken now. And it has to be restored. And that's going to take effort, and that's going to take time because there's consequences. It's just, you can't just say, I'm sorry, and a magic wand is waved, and the person is supposed to act like that never happened. By the way, that's not what the Bible calls us to with forgiveness. It's maybe another lesson I should do, an off kind of thing of just what is forgiveness from a biblical perspective. Now, I would just say this, particularly about consequences, because I've seen this in counseling situations quite a bit. Forgiveness is not the same as trusting someone. You can forgive someone for a past wrong or doing a past sin against you and still say, I don't trust you. That's completely legit. There's wisdom at times in that. So the consequence in that is, yes, there's forgiveness, but where trust is broken, it has to be rebuilt. And so there has to be time and investment and transparency, because you can't evade those consequences of that deception, that lie, that hurt, those wounds, adultery, murder. I mean, just think about someone's committed murder. Can there be forgiveness for that? Absolutely. Should there be civil sentences against people that have murdered? Of course, there's consequences to that. Gluttony, envy, slander, ... I mean, there's consequences. Temporal consequences to sin. And so atoning grace doesn't mean those things don't exist. And again, Exhibit A would be just read 2 Samuel. After chapter 11, there are consequences in David's life for his sin. Not because God is out to punish him, but there's consequences in the fabric of God's creation that we talked about before. In the wisdom literature, there's a sowing and reaping principle. It's in there. And you will harvest what you've sown. Sometimes you're not going to like that. But there's grace in that, even in that God will impress upon us very severely that sin is not your friend. That if you think sin is the path to your happiness or joy, it isn't. And the reality of these consequences confirm that very deeply in our hearts. God does not want us to make friends with sins, and so we suffer those consequences.
I also kind of think consequences should drive us closer to the Lord as a result.
Unquestionably, that's right. Yeah, not from him as if he's mad at us, but draw us toward him. David will not be put to death, so there's the atoning grace. Verse 13. There's going to be consequences in your house, David, but you're not going to die. David's not going to get really what he deserves. God has taken away David's sin. That's Nathan's language. God has put away your sin. How does that happen? God is not just. You've got an adulterer and a murderer. David, I'm not going to put you to death. Or it doesn't sound like God is committed to acting in justice. But he is. So even in this text, why is David not put to death, do you suppose? Why does God not give David what he deserves?
He's enduring heartache for years and years because his household or his sons, Absalom, his favorite son, rebel against him, and it keeps him miserable for years.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jane. How much misery David is in. I mean, he's certainly hurt at and grieving deeply at Absalom's death. But yeah, as we look at the narrative, he gets a little detached in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. Amnon kills Tamar, and what does David do? Nothing. Yeah, it's like, what is that? Doesn't really do anything. Absalom and his relationship gets fractured. Absalom leaves. Absalom comes back, lives near him, and what does David do? Nothing. It's like there's no reaching out and restoration with Absalom. It's just like, what are you doing? What are you doing, David? And I was actually thinking about that on the way over. It's like, what is it? What is exactly going on there? Where David, psychologically, for David, in some of that. But I mean, think about this. David is not put to death, but someone, even in our text, dies. Right. And that it seems like that's connected. I mean, Nathan wants David to connect that in some ways. David, you're not going to die. God has put away your sin. But because you've done this, is that the language in their time? Because you've done this?
By this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die.
Yeah. Because you've utterly scorned the Lord, the child born to you is going to die.
Another substitution.
Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, is this pointing, you think, then to another child?
I think so. I think so. I think so. Certainly for us looking back, right. I mean, how much David would have connected those things in terms of, I don't think David would have connected it to any kind of
but for us,
work of his offspring.
That big picture, it's a type again.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. So there's one who is judged with the sentence of death, even in this text, but it's not David. It's the son born to David who dies. And it's just it's a beautiful thing to see the gospel in the Old Testament. And to put it in that kind of generalized language. The son born to David is the one who dies instead. Yes. That is the central proclamation of the gospel. The son born to David is the one who dies to atone for the sins of his people. But it's not this son right here in chapter 12. You got to read forward a little bit. It's the greater son of David. Who, you open up the first page of the New Testament, you read Matthew's gospel. This is the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Son of Abraham, son of David. He's the one who dies an atoning death. Yeah, Devin.
In some ways, does it also reflect Adam and that lineage as well of under sin, then born into death? I don't know if that's a fair.
I don't know. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, that's an interesting question, Devin. Yeah. So, in conclusion, the alarm went off, so we'll wrap this up. So just some encouragement here, right? God's grace suffices to cover David's sin. Think about what David did in chapter 11. That's not good. Most of us have not outwardly acted the way that David did. David is responsible for taking a man's life. Can you imagine bearing that kind of guilt? And it's not like it was an accident that happened. I know what I did. This was one of my faithful, mighty men. He was a loyal soldier. I took his wife. She got pregnant. I tried to cover it up. It didn't work, so I had him killed. Wow. But God's atoning grace is sufficient to cover that. It doesn't remove consequences. Temporal consequences. It does remove eternal consequences for that. And so, here's the encouragement. If that grace suffices for David, an adulterer and a murderer, if that atoning grace suffices for Paul, a persecutor of the church, think about the past that might have weighed on his conscience. He wanted to kill Christians, and he stood by while some Christians were being killed in full support of it, and then he becomes a convert to Christianity and has to reflect back on a past where it's man, I was acting in direct opposition to the purposes of God. And he saved me. He rescued me and adopted me. That's why I think Paul never loses sight of grace. And if you think about it, it's how could Paul lose sight of grace, given who he is before he's saved on the Damascus road? But grace is sufficient for Paul. If that grace suffices for Peter, hey, stay awake and pray with me just for a while. He falls asleep. Doesn't do it. All of you will flee from me. No, I won't, Lord. Even if everybody else flees from you, I won't. Jesus gets arrested in the garden. Where are the disciples? All gone. They're all fleeing. And then, in the middle of Jesus' trial, Peter denies him 3 times. Jesus hears it. Right? In Luke's gospel, like, looks right at Peter. There's grace for that. So if God's grace suffices in all of these ways, I'm only mentioning a few of them, right? I mean, I could have mentioned Moses. Moses also strikes an Egyptian, kills him. Who else can we add? Who else can we add to this? Abraham lies about his wife, tries to aid God in the fulfillment of promises by sleeping with Sarah's servant Hagar, and just all of that. His grace is sufficient for all these people throughout the scriptures. And if that's true, then his grace can suffice for you too. I don't know if some of you are here tonight and talking about guilt and shame, actual guilt and real shame, true shame, are things that you carry around. But the good news of the gospel is your guilt is atoned for and your shame is covered. Those things are real and true in the gospel. And so to continue in your guilt and your shame, again, those things might not be real. Right? So that requires some discussion and counsel as well. But even when they're real, like that's what the work of Jesus does. It atones for real guilt. Not your imagined guilt, real guilt for real sins. And covers real shame for real disgraceful things that you've done. And to continue to sit in that is to really act and think in unbelief. But the blood of Christ isn't sufficient to atone and to cover. But it is. Believe the gospel. Believe the gospel. So no matter what you've done, where you've been before, there's grace for you. Quote from Mozart's Requiem, "Remember, merciful Jesus, that I am the cause of your journey." In other words, I'd say it like this. Your sins and my sins do not negate the work of Jesus on the cross. They're the reason for it. They're the reason for it. It just doesn't have to die on the cross. If you can somehow obtain your own righteousness, he came to die for real sins. And he came to pursue you. And one of the most encouraging things for me is his disciples fell asleep. They all fled at his arrest. Peter denies him. And Jesus knows all of that and still goes to the cross. This happens before. It's not like Jesus saw that happen and say, well, all right, never mind then. I'm calling the whole thing off. I'm not purchasing these people. No, that's precisely who he came to purchase and to rescue as the seeking shepherd who rescues lost sheep. You're the reason for his work. Now, there's transformation that happens when we recognize the power of that grace, and we'll see that in Psalm 51. But yeah, any closing questions here? I'm sorry. What do I have here? I forgot I had this slide on here. It's been said that a veterinarian... Oh yeah, I remember why this is here. It has been said that a veterinarian can learn a lot about the transforming part. Can learn a lot about a dog owner she's never met just by observing the dog. What does the world learn about God by looking at us? Christian author Philip Yancey writes about how he would ask strangers sitting next to him on airplanes what first came to mind when he said the words evangelical Christian. Now, by the way, this was probably 20 years ago. You might get different answers today, but maybe not. Listen to what he says. In reply, mostly I hear political descriptions. That probably hasn't changed all that much. Of strident pro-life activists or gay rights opponents. This is Yancey's words. Not once have I heard a description redolent of grace. Apparently that is not the aroma Christians give off in the world. And so there's as encouraging and comforting as this is, and it is, here's the challenge. To be a recipient of that kind of grace transforms a heart. If you know that grace, you have a tendency to show that grace. But you have to get to a point where you recognize that, yeah, I've not murdered people. I've not committed adultery. I've not acted like a terrorist like Paul. I've not done those outward things. But if I can commit murder in my heart against my brother, if I can commit lust in my heart, like Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, those exact two things, by the way, anger connected to murder and lust committed to adultery, if I can do those things, I'm not far removed here in my heart. And God has shown me grace. So as recipients of that grace, and I think the more we... So here's the interesting thing. We don't wallow in sin, but we don't minimize sin either. And the benefit of not minimizing our sin is it helps us accentuate the greatness of the gospel. It saves us from it. If our sin is this great, how great is God's grace that it trumps our sin? Well, it must be really great because my sin is really great. So it's interesting how that works, right? It's like if we try to minimize our sin, the consequence will be that we'll tend to minimize God's grace too. Yeah, he redeemed me, but I wasn't really that bad. Didn't take that much to redeem me. No, it took a lot. It took nails and blood and wrath and a substitute in hell for your place to save you from sin. And when we really do business with that, it transforms us into a gracious people. So, that's it for the first part. Comments, questions on 2 Samuel 12? I told you I was going to do a lot of talking tonight. Any insights that you had while I was talking that I didn't touch on? Yeah, Annabeth.
I guess I didn't catch the point about, like, whenever I read through this story, like, by myself before coming to class, like, I didn't catch the point about, like, he spared David's life, he let him live.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he has to live with his guilt, and there's consequences in his house the rest of his life, but his life was spared. Like, I didn't catch that detail. I found it very profound.
Yeah, good. Yeah, that's right.
Well, and did you ever, like, you asked about that, like, why did they spare his life?
Mm-hmm.
And my first thought was, well, I mean, the next child, actually, the line of David continues through the next child.
Right. Through Bathsheba.
Right, through Bathsheba,
Right.
through Solomon.
Right,
so
that's right.
there's a purpose there that God had, despite even David's decision and moral decline,
Yeah.
and maybe like distance from all the craziness going on. God was in that.
Yeah, that's right. That's a great point, Shannon, and yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because it reminds me of how God, he shows grace to David, sparing him, continuing to use him, continuing to be faithful to his line. But the line that he uses is the line of David and Bathsheba. I mean, think about that kind of grace to Bathsheba. So go back to Matthew, right? Starts with a genealogy, son of Abraham, son of David. Well, guess who's in that genealogy? The wife of Uriah, I think is the language. It doesn't say Bathsheba, which is quite interesting. The wife of Uriah, I think is what it says. But there's 4 women mentioned in that genealogy explicitly, which, by the way, is no minor point in that time in the world, to note women in someone's genealogy as being of substance. Sarah is one. Rahab, a prostitute from Canaan, is in there. Bathsheba is in there. I went out of order. And Ruth, a Moabite, is in there. It's like, wow. The genealogy itself that leads to the line, that leads to the Messiah, that leads to the Redeemer of all of God's people throughout the world, has Gentile blood, Canaanite blood, Moabite blood, the genes of a prostitute who was saved by faith By the way, that's what we should think about when we think about Rahab. It's not the lie that she told. It's the truth that she confesses. I've heard about what God did on the other side, and I know that your God is the true God. That's what we hear when we hear Rahab. Not, oh yeah, the spies were here, or those people that you're looking for were here, but they went out that way, and you might be able to catch them if you go. I always think, oh, should she have done that or not? And we miss her profession of faith in Israel's God. Here's this Canaanite who says, I'm taking your side. I'm lining up with you because you serve the true God. That's a wonderful profession of faith. But anyway, yeah, just this wonderful grace that God shows to Bathsheba. I think the same thing, actually. So David comes from what line?
Jesse.
Benjamin.
No, not Benjamin. That's Saul.
No, sorry.
Jesse, but in terms of like tribes of Israel.
So is that Judah?
He's from Judah. Who's Judah's mom?
Oh, is that Hagar? The other one.
No. So Jacob, remember, had
Wait,
four
Rachel
wives.
and Leah. It's Leah.
It's Leah.
Yeah.
Who's the one that Jacob loved?
Rachel.
Rachel.
And Leah was
And you'd
born.
think, well, of course, the line is going to come from Rachel. She's the favored one. No, it doesn't. It's Leah. It's so...
And at the end of Genesis, Judah doesn't come out smelling like roses.
Oh, no, yeah. Well, by the end, he's looking better.
Right.
But yeah, there's some interesting stories with Judah, for sure. But there's such warmth in that. Don't you think? It's like Leah had to live with a husband who didn't really love her. His heart belonged to somebody else. It's just like, man, I got a raw deal here. But my husband has eyes for my sister. And there's just this comforting thing that we're here talking tonight about Leah being the ancestor of the Messiah. It comes from that line. It's Judah. It's just, yeah, it's great. Anyway, we'll stop here. Got some things to cover in the next half hour with Psalm 51. We'll see if we can get through the whole thing. I'll try to go fast. So I apologize ahead of time for going fast through the